Welcome to a special interview segment of Joe and the Fat Man. This is Joe Smeltzer of Nittany Sports Now, and it might be hard to believe with all the talk about the coaching staff, recruiting, the long-term impact of James Franklin's firing, but Penn State still has a football season to play, and only a little more than half of it's done. There's 5 games to go. The first one is going to be what we thought would be a huge game in Columbus between Penn State and Ohio State, but it didn't really turn out that way. Ohio State's taking care of business. Penn State has done the opposite of that over the last month. And as a result, Ohio State is expected to win and win big. And to talk a little more about the Buckeyes, we're going to bring in a guy that's been covering the team on a full-time basis since 2015. He's been writing for Bucknuts, which is the Ohio State 24/7 site, since 2016. Patrick Murphy, thank you for joining us.
Hey, how you doing, Joe? Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So before the season, a lot of people thought this might be a number 1 versus number 2 game of the century type matchup. I think the worst case scenario was people thought it would be a top 10 matchup with Penn State maybe losing a game in Oregon. But Penn State's season has absolutely imploded, obviously, and that's led to James Franklin's firing. So from the outside, what has been the perception just nationally as somebody that covers the Big Ten of what's been happening at Penn State over the past month?
The first word that comes to mind is surprising. And, whether you believed in James Franklin and some of the preseason hype about Penn State sort of following in the path that Ohio State and Michigan took the last 2 years, I don't think anyone expected this. Like I was watching the Penn State Oregon game. I caught kind of the second half of that after we were out in Washington for when the Buckeyes were playing, and then rewatched the game afterwards. And it's like, okay, look, Penn State lost another big time game. That is unfortunate, but it's one loss. It's in double overtime. Yes, it's at home, but not a big deal. You can rebound. Ohio State won the national championship last year with 2 losses, as everyone knows. So my thought was, okay, they're going to go on this run over the next couple of weeks. They'll come into Columbus, and this will still be a really big game. Maybe it won't be 1 versus 2 or 1 versus 3 or whatever it was shaping up to be, but it'll still be a top 10, top 15 game. So the surprising part wasn't losing to Oregon. It was what came next, which I think is how most Penn State fans feel, right? And the fact that the Nittany Lions weren't able to rebound from that is telling for me, because I think you look at what Ohio State did after Oregon a year ago, and that bounce back was pretty impressive. And that's what eventually led them to the Michigan game, where they had to bounce back again, and then go on that run in the college football playoffs. So you have to be able to respond. 1 loss isn't the end of a season anymore. And that's where I think the biggest shock has been, is that under James Franklin, and even 2 weeks ago at Iowa, which was a more competitive game, no doubt, they haven't been able to figure out a way to do what they've been so good at, and that's beating the teams they're supposed to, right? This is a team that was in the college football playoff semifinal last year, and you compete a couple passes to a receiver, and maybe you're playing Ohio State in the national championship game, right? And who knows what happens there. So yeah, I just think it's pretty shocking how quickly these things have sort of spiraled in State College. But then I look around at the kind of other national or other college football teams across the country, and we just see LSU firing Brian Kelly on a 3-game losing streak, and some of these other jobs that have come open. And it's like, well, if you're not winning at the level you're expected to now, boosters, people donating to NIL, whoever, have a bigger say than ever before. And those voices and maybe some knee-jerk reactions, and I'm not saying that's what that was necessarily in either of those cases, it just seems like it's quicker to happen now than maybe it would have a few years ago if this were the case.
So a big reason a lot of people pegged Penn State as a national title favorite was getting Jim Knowles from Ohio State. You look at the last 4 games against Oregon, the defense was 1 stop away from getting that win. It didn't happen. UCLA was just a mess from bell to bell. The defense never really showed up there. Northwestern needed a late stop, couldn't get it. Iowa, kind of the same thing. So going back to before the season, there were a lot of Ohio State people saying that, Jim's defense is going to take some time to getting used to, and Penn State would struggle with that. And I think most Penn State people just saw that as bitterness because Penn State took Jim Knowles from Ohio State, but that's kind of coming to fruition. So going back to when Penn State made the hire with Jim Knowles, Was your thought that maybe the complexity of his defense would be an issue for this team?
I don't know if it was necessarily an issue. I just have seen the way it takes for the time it takes for Jim Knowles to build that defense. And not just at Ohio State, but when we looked back when he was first hired from Oklahoma State, you look at what he did at Duke, you look at what he did at Oklahoma State, like those defenses got better year after year, and you saw the progression. And so even his first year in Columbus, obviously people were frustrated, fans especially, that the defense was giving up big plays and couldn't get stops when it needed to, things like that. But there was always, hey, let's look at what he did at Oklahoma State. Like year one was good, year two was better, year three was really good. And that was kind of the progression that followed at Ohio State, obviously culminating in the national championship last year. So not surprised. I think if James Franklin felt this would be a quick fix, I have to think that he did his homework, right? He knew if I can do that research, he can do that research and figure out, okay, yes, he could help improve us or at least help us maintain what we had the year prior, which was a very good defense. But to do what he wants to do takes a couple of years. And so maybe now, in retrospect, looking back at that hire, it wasn't the guy. Maybe you want a guy who can come in and basically just do what Penn State was doing before. I do think, we'll see what happens with the coaching hire. But if Jim Knowles stays there, Penn State has recruited well defensively. I think that defense can continue to be really, really good and get better under him. But it's just a matter of, getting the complexities of that defense down. And I know I've seen, on message boards and social media and stuff, people saying, well, Ohio State's went from, Jim Knowles' defense to Matt Patricia's defense. And, that's supposed to be complex. Why has there been no letdown for the Buckeyes? And I think it's just because there were enough similarities and the rest of the staff stayed. Everybody else except for Jim Knowles came back. So like there was continuity. Matt Patricia didn't have one set thing that he wanted to do to run his defense, whereas Jim Knowles is very specific on the kind of, the kind of players and things like that. So it just takes time. And, you can argue different things. Jim Knowles' defense has produced. Ultimately, it just hasn't produced the way Penn State wanted to. Not that I think that is the only reason that this team has had the struggles it's had.
So Ohio State in the Ryan Day era and probably towards the end of the Urban Meyer era too has been known for quarterback play, receiver play, skill positions. But this is the best defense in America, at least statistically. So you mentioned Matt Patricia, and talk a little more about just why things have worked so well defensively this season.
Well, yeah, I mentioned the continuity on the staff, and I think that's been huge. Matt Patricia came in, and he'd worked with Tim Walton, who is sort of the secondaries coach and probably kind of the next guy up. If Matt Patricia got COVID, I think it would either be Larry Johnson, the defensive line coach, who Penn State fans obviously know very well, or Tim Walton, the cornerback / secondary coach, who would run the defense in that situation. I think the fact that those two had worked together, Matt Patricia and Ryan Day knew each other well. Ryan Day grew up a huge Patriots fan, so he was sort of around that program as he came up as a coach, working at Boston College and stuff, so he knew Matt Patricia pretty well. And then he'd worked out James Laurinaitis, when the linebackers coach at Ohio State, when James Laurinaitis was coming out of Ohio State as a player. So there was just already some relationships there. And then, as I mentioned, you look at what Matt Patricia's done with defenses over the years, like it changes based on personnel. And I think that's one thing that he and Bill Belichick were really good at in New England was, okay, here's what we've got. How do we maximize our best players? How do we help our weak links types? And so the defense had to be moldable. You don't win Super Bowls the way they did and just have one style of defense that you have to fit everybody in, right? And I think that made it easy when he came in, and he talked about this actually this week. He came in and sort of observed during spring, okay, who do I have? What can they do? Obviously, he knew some of the names, a Caleb Downs. He'd actually coached some of the players on the defensive side of the ball's parents when their dads were coming up. So he knew some about it, but he used the spring to kind of evaluate and then sort of figure out what do we want to do, what maximizes these players' strengths and puts us in the best position to win. And have adjusted to that. And I think they've adjusted as the season's gone on as well, based on opponent and things like that. So it is a very pro-like defense in the fact that it is moldable to kind of cater to what you're seeing each week.
So talking about Ohio State's offensive coordinator, Brian Hartline's the guy that's been talked about with the Penn State coaching search really since pretty soon after James Franklin got fired. I reported for Nittany Sports Now a few hours ago that Hartline is a candidate. So generally speaking, what's the possibility that he wants to be a head coach and would be a good fit? And also, without giving away things that your readers and subscribers don't already have access to, what insight do you have on the realistic possibility of Brian Hartline taking a job like Penn State?
Well, first, to answer your first question, I think the question that everyone has asked the last few years, because this is not the first time Brian Hartline's name has been linked to a open head coaching vacancy. He's interviewed at Cincinnati, I believe a couple other places. So I think that the question is that you asked if Brian Hartline wants to be a head coach is one that we don't really know. Obviously, agents and things will push you to having these interviews just to have the experience of doing it. I think, and this is my speculation more than anything, Brian Hartline loves coaching wide receivers. Now, you're not just going to be a wide receivers coach. I mean, I guess you could be, but how often do you see a guy just stay a wide receivers coach? You really don't. If he's good enough, he eventually moves up to offensive coordinator like Brian Hartline has this year. But while he is doing that and he's working with the offense significantly more, he still is with the wide receivers a lot. And so I do wonder if he actually has interest in going and, hey, let's be a head coach where I'm even further removed from the position I enjoy coaching the most. I know, Brian Hartline was never a guy who, growing up wanted to be a coach. He was a player, and then he just kind of ended up as a GA at Ohio State, just was back in town and sort of around the program. And just, it's kind of happened. So I don't think he's a guy who set out like, hey, I want to work my way up. I want to be a head coach someday. Now, that's not to say he wouldn't if the right opportunity came along. As for what we've heard, not much, I'm going to be honest. My opinion, I think Brian Hartline's probably not ready for that at this point. He's technically by title been Ohio State's offensive coordinator or co-offensive coordinator for the last 2 years prior to this one. But this is the first time he's calling plays. Ryan Day did it in 2023, wasn't ready to give him play calling. And then last year, obviously, Chip Kelly comes in. They're co-offensive coordinators, but Chip Kelly's the one calling the plays. So, but for all intents and purposes, this is his first year as a true offensive coordinator. I think you need some more time to go through that. Not only just learn about everything, but learn about what it takes. Working closely with Ryan Day, even closer than he has, so that the stuff off the field that you have to manage and things like that. You have to know how to do that. You have to have the right people, and certainly he knows people in the sport. But the longer you are an offensive coordinator, an assistant coach, whatever, I think the more those people you know. So for me, and I don't want to speak for Brian Hartline here, obviously, but I think it would make sense for him to be an offensive coordinator for a little bit. And let's remember, his first offensive coordinator job is at Ohio State. Like, that doesn't normally happen, right? You usually work your way up. You're a GA somewhere else. You become a position coach there. You move around. And all. Brian Hartline has fast-tracked his career at one of the top jobs in the country. And so while it's worked out well, is he ready to that quickly make a jump to being a head coach and a head coach somewhere else where he's only been at one place, right? So for those reasons, I would be skeptical. But I think he knows ball, and I think given time, he could be a really good head coach if that's the path he wants. Question is Penn State willing to give a young, inexperienced head coach that kind of time? Based on this year, probably not.
So we can read Hartline's resume. Obviously, what he's done with the receivers speaks for itself. Now that actually answered a question I was going to ask, which how much of the offense is his and how much is Ryan Day's. He is calling plays this year, and that's gone well. Julian Sands, a Heisman candidate. As far as personality goes, as somebody that's around him, what does he do well that would make Marvin Harrison Jr. Want to play for him at Ohio State?
Yeah, I think the best thing in terms of that is his relationship he builds with these kids. I think it became apparent pretty quickly. If you think back, Brian Hartline became the GA in 2017. Then there was all this Zach Smith situation. I'm sure people will remember him getting fired and Brian Hartline was basically the assistant wide receivers coach and got thrust into the interim role that next year and then became the full-time guy. But very quickly it became clear that he was really good at building relationships with his own players and the recruits that he brings in to the building. I think if you're ever around him, he's still a relatively young guy. And I think his personality just works well with these kids. He can relate at a way that not all coaches can. Ohio State has a couple coaches. I mentioned James Laurinaitis earlier, like another young guy who still kind of is young enough to kind of get the lingo and, listens to the same music and that type of stuff. And, that might not seem like a ton, but I think especially when you don't have a name like he did early on, that relationships really matter. That ability to build that relationship quickly really matters. And then obviously it matters down the line. And look, I think he can point to what he's done too, especially at the wide receiver position. Like, I played at Ohio State. I know what it takes to be successful here. Right. I went to the NFL. I played for the Dolphins and the Browns. Like, you can put on the film. And I think that helps. Kids probably don't remember him. It's not like he was a superstar at Ohio State. He was very good, but not a superstar or in the NFL. So it's not like he's a Marvin Harrison Sr. who you might say to some kid and he's like, oh yeah, I've watched his highlights 100 times. But you do have that film you can put on. And now he's built that track record. So, I think that's kind of how he started it. And then once you start to have success with these guys and, the NFL draft and the names and everything like that, it just kind of snowballs. Not to say that it doesn't take work. It certainly does. I mean, ask Brian Hartline about trying to keep Jeremiah Smith away from some teams down in South Florida on signing day. And he's got some stories there. But, I think once you have some success like he has at that position or at any position, you can use that to kind of snowball and build what he's built at Ohio State.
So you were on the beat for the last few years, last 4 seasons of Urban Meyer's tenure. When Penn State fired James Franklin, you knew Urban Meyer's name was going to come up because he's Urban Meyer. And there's also that connection with Penn State. Allegedly, he was close to taking the job in 2011. How true that is, I don't know. But he's been reported in this search as well. Did that ever have any legs? He met with a Pennsylvania senator, which people drew their conclusions on that. But was that something that you think was ever a thing? I personally am very skeptical, but I didn't know if you had any other insight. And if Urban Meyer wanted to get back into coaching, would he be able to handle this very new era of college football, which is pretty close to the NFL, which obviously we all know what happened there?
To answer your first question about the time in 2011, I don't know anything specifically. I do know that when Urban Meyer left Florida, he felt like he had not finished his career. Now, he had these health issues. He had the heart stuff. He had to get that figured out, and that was priority number one. But I think being around the game, he has, talks about when he was on the sideline for the national championship game that year that he was off and just kind of looking out and sort of missing it. So I do think he wanted to get back into coaching. And if the Ohio State job is not open, a Penn State job would be really interesting, I think, to a guy like him. Obviously he's from Ohio, so I think Ohio State, Notre Dame is another job that's always been floated out there as a dream job for him, being a Catholic and kind of growing up with the dominance that Notre Dame was. But Penn State, the opportunity to win big at a program like that in the Big Ten. Again, if Ohio State hadn't come open, maybe there's a possibility. Again, just speculating, but I could see it. As for Urban Meyer in today's game, that's where I have questions. I'm not even sure he would really be that interested. Now, I think you pick up the phone if Penn State calls you or if Penn State has called you and hear him out, because you just never know. But from my understanding, and I don't have much of a relationship other than when he was here with Urban Meyer and every once in a while when we see him, but I do know people that do. And my understanding is he's very happy with the way things have gone. He can still be involved in college sports by working with Fox. He gets to do the, breakdowns during the week. And then obviously his stuff on days, and still gets to travel and be on campuses, but not as much the intensity and whatnot. But to your point, the NIL era, the transfer portal era, I don't know. We've seen Nick Saban get out of it and go do what Urban Meyer's doing for ESPN. I think that those type of coaches probably look at this and are like, what the heck is going on? Would I want to be involved in that? Now, you do mention Urban Meyer did give it a year in the NFL. So I think if he did want to get back in, if you could get the right people so that maybe he's not having to handle as much of that, possibly. But I really think for Urban, it's if he were to get back in, it would be just to coach ball, and that's just not realistic anymore in college football.
All right, so talking about Saturday's game, because it's always going to be weird for me these next several weeks, knowing that there's still a season, because the season feels like a backdrop. But is there anything that Ohio State should be concerned about with Penn State? Because even if, say, Penn State only had one loss and was ranked very highly, the spread would still be pretty big because there's no Drew Aller. So backup quarterback, lost 4 straight, all kinds of outside noise, going on the road to a place Penn State doesn't even win when they're good. Is there anything to Ohio State fans are concerning themselves with about Saturday?
I think the biggest concern would be Ohio State sort of looking past Penn State because of firing James Franklin, because of no Drew Aller, because of these 4 straight losses, and sort of thinking, hey, we're at home, we've got this. The Buckeyes have not had one of those games this year. The closest probably was 2 weeks ago, their last game against Wisconsin in Madison, where they won 34-0. So it wasn't like they slept walk through the game and came out with a narrow win, but it wasn't full tilt Ohio State at the best we've seen them. But again, they still won 34-0. So is this a kind of game, almost a trap game, I guess you could call it, where Ohio State just isn't as focused as they have been because it's human nature to look at what Penn State's done recently and not think very highly of the Nittany Lions, which I think would be a mistake because you mentioned it, no Drew Aller, no James Franklin, obviously the loss, but there is still talent on this team. There's a reason this team was number 2 in the country in the preseason polls. So I think if Ohio State doesn't give this game the same kind of attention it's done every week this season, and that's been something I've been really impressed about with Ryan Day and his approach to this year, because you're coming off a national championship, it'd be easy to just go into these games, especially after you beat Texas week 1, and just kind of, okay, we're good. We know we're good. It happened. I saw it in 2015 after Ohio State won the national championship in 2014. Like, they just thought they could beat anybody, and for the most part, they were right until they got beat. So that has been impressive from this group, but they've got to keep it going, and that specifically includes this week.
Is this personal for Ryan Day because of how the Jim Knowles era ended? Is there, because that's, people are going to say that, but is there any legs to that?
I think probably if you were able to get Ryan Day to be very honest deep down, probably. But I don't think it's any more so than, if any other coach had left in a similar manner, right? It's sort of a weird way to go. There's talk about if he's leaving Oklahoma State. There were a few other places rumored before even Penn State really came into the picture during the run to the national championship. And that's probably not what you want, right? You want your defensive coordinator focused. Now, obviously, it all worked out. But I think probably a little bit. But I also think Ryan Day understands, like, this is the business of college sports. Coaches come and go. I think it might be a little bit more if Matt Patricia hadn't worked out as well. And maybe you're kind of looking at what we could have continued to build here in Columbus. I don't know the inner workings behind the relationship with Ryan Day and Jim Knowles. I would imagine that there wasn't a ton of a personal, off the fields, out of the building relationship, just kind of knowing Jim Knowles a little bit. He's go to work, be in the office, yep. Get stuff done. I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know or your listeners don't. So I don't imagine maybe that was as, if they had been really close and then Jim Knowles had just kind of bailed on the program, which I'm not saying he did. I'm just, if that were the case, maybe there's a little more animosity. But yeah, I think, look, they're competitors, right? And I think Jim Knowles, same way, will want to have this defense fired up. 2 weeks ago when Ohio State plays Wisconsin, Luke Fickell, former Buckeye player, former Buckeye assistant, former Buckeye interim, he was the head coach of that 2011 season. So that game, and he's talked about it before, means a little bit more when he gets to play Ohio State. Didn't translate to a result on the field, but I think it would be something a little bit similar.
I know it's only Monday, but I think most people have a pretty good idea of how this is going to go. So what would your prediction be for Saturday?
Yeah, I have not dove into it, so let's just be clear that by the end of the week, this sort of might change. Look, I think it would be hard to pick against Ohio State. As you mentioned, as we've covered, the struggles with Penn State and the fact that even good Penn State teams have had their issues in Columbus, even if they've had really good starts to games at times. So I think, the picking the Buckeyes is the logical thing to do, regardless of what side you're on. But what the score will be, I don't know. I don't know if I have that quite yet. I've told people, I was talking to some friends over the weekend who are big Buckeye fans. They were asking me about the game, and would it surprise me if this is closer than people expect at halftime? Because Penn State looks at this as, their Super Bowl, basically, come out and play up to as well as they've played this season and make things close into the third quarter. No, I wouldn't be that surprised. I still think there's talent on this team. And I watched that Iowa game 2 weeks ago and saw a lot more fight in that game. So, I expect this to be somewhat competitive. I think, the lack of Drew Aller, some other guys that may or may not be banged up. I think I saw today, James Franklin said a lot of guys are back, which is good news for Penn State. But again, if Ohio State approaches this the same way they would have approached it if the rankings were what they were in the preseason, then I think they will be fine. But it's only human nature to have one of those games, a couple of those games a year. And this is a real opportunity for Penn State to at least not right the ship, but at least get it sort of headed back on the right track. And I think back to, we talked about 2011 a couple of times. Ohio State went 6-7 that year. But one win that everyone always points to is Wisconsin comes to Columbus with Russell Wilson, and they were top 10, top 15 team. Ohio State knocks them off on a last-second Hail Mary. That's the game that everyone talks about in that season, not the other games that were awful for Buckeye fans. Even some of the wins were awful for Buckeye fans. So if Penn State could get that, you're going to look back on this year as a failure, no doubt. But hey, you came in and knocked off the number one Buckeyes. That's at least something to kind of hang your hat on there. And so that gives me a little bit of pause when I look at the big spreads and things like that, because I do think they can make this a fight.
All right. Patrick Murphy, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you at the shoe on Saturday.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Sounds good.